Okay, thank you. Thank you so much again for having me here tonight to talk about rain gardens. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the San Antonio River Basin that you can see here. The different colors represent the watersheds within the San Antonio River Basin. And to orient you here, I'm going to show you Boerne is right about here. You can see where my cursor is within the Cibolo Creek watershed that joins the San Antonio River down in Karnes County. And then to the west, we have the Medina River watershed that joins up with the San Antonio River around Loop 1604, south of San Antonio. And then here's about downtown San Antonio right here within the upper San Antonio watershed. We also have Leon Creek watershed and Salado Creek watershed. And then in the lower part of our basin, it's called the lower San Antonio watershed. So of course, all of these watersheds feed into the San Antonio River that eventually joins the Guadalupe River just above San Antonio Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. And so within these different watersheds, there are varying degrees of watershed health. A lot of it depends on how much of that land cover has been altered from natural vegetation to impervious surfaces, things like our roadways and our buildings, our parking lots, all of those hard surfaces. We've converted the landscape for our own uses, and what we've realized over the last few decades is that the way that we managed stormwater in the past has really caused some challenges and some major problems for the health of our watersheds. And in the past, all we really were concerned about was getting that water off of a site as quickly as possible and to prevent flooding. And so that all makes sense, but what we didn't realize necessarily at the time were the consequences of sending all that water so quickly into our natural stream systems. And so we know now that there are some problems with that. We know that there are a lot of issues with hard surfaces and runoff, not just for flooding, but for water quality, because there are a lot of different pollutants that gather on those surfaces in between rain events. And then once it rains, it washes everything off. And in our cases here, our stormwater doesn't get treated. It goes right into a drain and into a pipe and into the nearest waterway, which might be a ditch. Maybe it used to be a creek. It might be going right into the San Antonio River in downtown San Antonio, for example. That's exactly what happens off of all of those hard surfaces. And so there's no time for that water to be filtered through soils. There's no place for it to be filtered through soils or through plants in many cases. And so we end up getting a lot of water quality problems because of those concentrated pollutants that are getting sent down into our waterways. Now, a lot of these common pollutants include bacteria, sediment, nutrients, metals, oils and grease, trash. We see a lot of the trash. It's very obvious to us. Some of these other things you can't really see. Speaking of heat, heat is a big one that can actually cause some pretty significant fish kills. Imagine a hot summer day and we haven't had rain in a long time, and then suddenly we get a quick rain event. It hits that hot asphalt and goes right into a creek. That temperature increase can be enough to cause some very negative impacts to aquatic life. And so any number of pollutants can be found in any of these systems. And so what we're trying to look at are ways that we can try to reduce the amount of those pollutants going into our waterways. And we know that a lot of it has to do with just capturing what's called that first flush, that initial wash off of everything that's accumulated on those dry surfaces from rain events. And a lot of times it doesn't take a whole lot in order to do that. And so we're going to talk about just a few ways to do that. And here's another resource. The map I showed you earlier was from a map viewer that the River Authority has on our website. It was our watershed master plan viewer. This is another really interesting online resource. This one is from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it's called the Ecosystem analytical mapper. And this shows land cover in pretty good detail. And what you can see here is really the pink color, the pink and red color. Those are land covers that are mostly impervious. These are hard surfaces that are preventing the water from going into soils and getting filtered. And you can see that's San Antonio, essentially, urbanized San Antonio. And you can see here's Boerne's, this little blip right up in here. And you can see the other towns on the way. But what's interesting about this land cover is you can go in and you can actually identify some of these natural areas too. And you can see what they are composed of in terms of plants, both native and non-native. And so you might find this very interesting because when it comes to trying to figure out which plants would work best in your yard or your landscape, it's really good to look around you and look in those remaining natural areas, especially any remaining natural areas that are of higher quality, to see what kinds of plants are present. But you can see here, just with that amount of impervious, that pink and red, that those are the areas where we know we really have some work to do. And any developing areas as well. We want to develop smarter. So what can we do to help our watershed, whether it's in our own yard or something that's a larger public project? We want to look for ways to slow the water down. As I mentioned before, historically, we've tried to send that water off as quickly as possible because we were afraid of flooding, and we should be, right? But we want to try to slow it down in a safe way. We want to try to spread the runoff out throughout the landscape, so we're not concentrating it into one spot. We want to mimic nature. And then really we want to find ways that we can soak this runoff into soils where it can be cleaned by all of the organisms in the soils themselves, the plants, the roots, the whole system, and really try to mimic nature. You might have heard approaches like this or that follow these concepts as nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure. There's a lot of terminology about it, but the focus is really about water quality. And so one way that tends to be a little simple in many cases, especially if you've got a roof system and gutter system, is to slow it down by temporarily capturing that water in a container. And so here we have some residential applications of what we would call rain barrels. And they come in all different styles. We've got 50 to 55 gallon is kind of a standard size that you can find, different plastic options. These were some that were decorated, and the owner's very colorful, loves color in her garden, and so she decorated these. Here's a really fancy one, an ung jar, and you know you can go super fancy on these, or you can go basic. You can combine barrels together to capture more of that water. Really, there's all kinds of options here. And slowing down that water can be really helpful, and it could help to reduce localized flooding depending on situation. And some of these rain barrels have multiple outlets. And so you can see here, there's an outlet on the bottom that you could connect to and drain the entire barrel. Or there's one that's a little bit higher up that you could use, and you could keep and reserve some amount of that rainwater for watering your plants or whatever. But when you temporarily capture this water, you do, if it's for water quality of the watershed, you want to use that water. You don't want to have a full barrel all the time, because the next rain event, you won't have any capacity for the new rain. So you want to use it. And one way to do that is just to slowly release it into the landscape. That helps to soak it into soils. You could connect a hose to the bottom here and have it set to just slowly drain out to where your rain barrel will empty eventually, and you'll be soaking that water into soil. So great use of that water. Lots of options here. You could also just fill a watering can and water your plants with it too. And of course, these can be much bigger in size. These are commercial applications. We call these cisterns. And we're seeing more and more of these around in the San Antonio area. People are starting to realize that these are pretty simple solutions. As I mentioned, when you have a rooftop and a gutter system, or you're putting one in, These are pretty simple to help to slow that water down. And then you can use the water in various ways, beneficial reuses of water for landscape irrigation or other purposes. Other ways are to use impervious surfaces instead of pervious. So instead of making a completely solid sidewalk of concrete, break it up a little bit and use some pervious materials. Flagstones are really common material used here. This one's got some gravel around it and vegetation, but this area, while it's still a nice patio scape, it's all pervious. Same here. These are ready-made smaller blocks. These are ready-made larger blocks, about 2 feet by 4 feet roughly, these ones. And then these are poured in place concrete. But you can see that there's a mixture of what would be impervious little pieces, but surrounded by pervious mulch or rock or vegetation. So that helps to slow it down and soak it in. And just as the previous example, this can also be done at a much larger scale, much more intensive scale. Commercial applications use permeable pavement for parking lots and other surfaces, and they can be quite elaborate. They can actually do a lot of filtering. In this case, in the rendering on the left, you can see there's multiple layers of gravel and sand, and then any water runoff that would go through this system would be filtered by this system and all the different layers. And then when it got to the bottom here, there's a perforated pipe, but it would have been filtered, and that water would have also been slowed down as it moved through this system. These can also be designed to store water too. And so on the right is an example, a local example here from San Antonio at Confluence Park. And if you haven't been there yet, I highly recommend it. It's a great place to visit. The entire park is designed based on sustainability. And so this permeable pavement system is just one element, but all of these different pavers and rock and materials are pervious. And then this particular system actually sends that water to a very large underground cistern, and then that water is used in the landscape as well as for toilet flushing of the park. So there are a lot of creative ways and artistic ways to use these materials and these approaches. And then, of course, you can slow it down and soak it in by temporarily capturing that runoff and then filtering it with plants and soils in a rain garden, which is what I'm going to be talking about mostly tonight. Here's a couple of examples from San Antonio. And then again, these can be done at much larger sites and can be quite engineered. They can also have multiple layers, filtering layers. They can have engineered soil media that allows the water to go through very quickly. Here's an example for the city of San Antonio parking lot, Development Services Department parking lot. So this entire parking lot was created to drain into this beautiful bioretention system called a bioswale here that looks like a beautiful landscaped boulevard planting. But it's actually also treating that stormwater, and any water that enters the storm system pipes from this has been filtered through multiple layers, like you can see shown on the left side here. So bioretention is really the best way when you're able to not only just slow the water down, but really let it filter and let it be cleaned up by all of the living organisms that are part of the soil and the plant system. So that's what we'd really like to see everywhere. Okay, so let's get into rain gardens, which is what I'm going to talk mostly about tonight, and some of these basic guidelines for building a residential rain garden. So how a rain garden works is that you basically create a a depression that temporarily captures that runoff, and that's been directed to it. And ideally, you can have that runoff that's been captured infiltrate through the existing soils, as well as evaporation will address some of the water that's within it. That's a simple explanation of what happens. And so when you're trying to find a location for your rain garden, you want to find a gentle slope that's along a path, of concentrated rainwater runoff, leading away from the home or other structure. So what I'm going to show you is really the simplest way. No, some sites really are this simple, but many sites are a little more complex. So we're going to just talk about what the simple way would be, and then we'll talk about some alternatives in case yours is not as simple. But you definitely want the water going away from your home. And in the simplest scenario, you would be able to come in and remove soil for your rain garden and just use it, reuse it to where ideally you wouldn't have to bring any material in or take any material away. It would be a perfect balance, and you would get your rain garden out of it. But some people are in locations where they can't dig because the soil is so shallow, bedrock's really high, whatever reason, might be just way too rocky, it's just impossible to dig. You might have to look at an alternative to digging, which would be more like terracing, installing berms above ground, and hopefully you wouldn't have to bring a whole lot of material in to do that. Maybe there's some materials on site that you can already use, or there's some other places. And obviously the larger the property you're working with, the more likely that scenario is versus a smaller city lot, for example. You may not, you maybe would have to bring some material in. Okay, so it's also recommended that you site your rain garden at least 10 feet away from your home or any other significant structure. And also it's recommended that the depth of the rain garden be 12 inches or less. A lot of times residential rain gardens tend to be more like 9 inches or so. That really, it's up to you. It can be as big and shallow or as deep and small as you really would want. But ideally, 12 inches or less is a good depth for a residential setting for the amount of water you would anticipate. And also the goal is that this isn't going to be holding water for a really long time. You want that water to leave. And so 12 inches or less is a really good standard depth to aim for. And then before you dig anywhere, call 811, because you want to make sure that you know where all of your utilities are. You don't want to be digging into a gas line. It's easy to forget where all of these things are, so call 811 always before you're going to be doing any digging like this. Now you want to see if your soils are going to support a rain garden, meaning that you want your soils to be able to drain that rain garden, ideally within about 24 hours. That's what we usually shoot for. And there are ways that you can do simple tests of your soil. And what you'll want to do is you will want to determine whether the bottom of your rain garden is going to be able to drain that water. So here I am, if my rain garden is only 6 inches deep, I'm going to need to dig that 6 inches to where I get to where the bottom of the rain garden is going to be. And then I'm going to need to dig 12 inches because it's that 12 inches that I'm going to be timing to make sure my rain garden is going to drain. So if my rain garden is going to be 6 inches, I'm going to need to dig 6 plus 12, which is 18 inches. So 18-inch hole is a pretty big hole. If your rain garden is going to be 12 inches deep, you would add another 12 to that. So you would be needing to dig 24 inches down for your test hole. So once you get your test hole, you're going to fill it with water and let it drain completely. But while it's still wet, you want to fill it again and start timing it. And you want to see how long it takes for that water to completely drain after it's gone through that process. And if it drains within 24 hours, then that tells you that your soils are supportive of a rain garden. If it doesn't drain within 24 hours, there are some things to think about. You may want to find a different location for your rain garden. Maybe you have a mixture of soils. Maybe you have better soils somewhere else. And maybe it's not in the ideal location you wanted, but you really do want these gardens to drain. You may also want to consider a more intensive design with an underdrain. That is an option. And you also might want to consider other ways besides a rain garden, because not every site is actually going to be supportive of a rain garden. It's not going to be the solution everywhere. So consider other ways to mimic nature, to slow down the runoff, to spread it out in the landscape and allow it to soak in different ways. Okay, so the other important thing to think about is how the water is going to leave. You've got to make sure that if that rain garden gets full and overflows, the water is going to be going directed safely away. So make sure it'll flow away from the house and other structures when it's overflowing. And it's a good idea to stabilize both the location where the water is coming in. Usually it's going to be coming from a gutter system, so it's a little concentrated pipe. And then the overflow, a simple solution is to put some kind of a rock, whether that's a decorative flagstone or river rock or whatever, at both the location the water's coming in, where it's concentrated, and where you want it to leave, to keep those locations stable. And so here's my rain garden, and I've got a river rock that is decorative around one edge. Here you can see framing it, but this is where the water comes in and this is where the water goes out. And so the rock is decorative, but it's also serving a purpose in both of those locations. So I'm just getting a notice. I hope you all are able to hear me well, because I just got a notice that low system resources may affect your audio quality. So I apologize if it's not going well. I hope it's okay. So let's talk about selecting plants for your rain garden. Well, these are things to think about, not just for rain gardens. We'll talk about rain gardens in a little more detail in a second, but a very important thing to think about anytime are the site conditions that plant's going to be in, of course, light, moisture, and soils. And it's easy to forget that when you go to the nursery and you just start seeing plants and you just start buying plants, and I've done it, everybody does it. But try to think about the actual conditions where you're going to put that plant. Also think about the mature size of that plant. A lot of times we're buying them small, little 3-inch pots, 4-inch pots, and we just don't even think about that this thing is going to get 4 feet wide. So trying to do a little bit of research before going in. The beauty with our cell phones now, if you've got a smartphone, is you can be at the nursery, you can look up anything and get all of the information you need right there. Through Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center or through Native Plant Society websites and information and materials. Look it up, do a little bit of research on that before you make a big investment. And then also look at how that plant spreads, because if you don't want a plant that's going to spread really quickly by either seed or by above ground stems or underground stems, you want to know that, because if you don't want that and you buy one that does it, you're not going to be happy and you're going to hate that plant, and it's not the plant's fault. So think about that. Also, of course, aesthetics, and everybody's aesthetics are different, but we all like to have a little bit of variety in color and variety in textures and interest throughout the seasons. And so those are always good to think about as well when selecting your plants. Maintenance needs as well. Some plants are higher maintenance than others. It might be your aesthetics that are driving the maintenance. And if you're a person that really likes things very formal and you do a lot of pruning and things, well, the maintenance is going to be higher just because of that aesthetic. So think about that too. And then the last item on here is that, are there any known negative impacts on the local ecosystem from that plant? And we do have a handful of plants here that you can buy in the nursery that are known to have negative impacts on our local ecosystem. And so I would ask that if the answer to that question is yes for a plant, that you look at another plant. Usually the answer yes to that question involves non-native species very often. And so particularly if you're looking at non-native species, really look into whether they're known to have any negative impacts. We don't want to be choosing those plants. Okay, so what about a rain garden? Well, here's a cross-section, very simple cross-section of a rain garden. And most of the time, the rain garden is going to be dry because most of the time around here, it's usually pretty dry. But then when we get a rain event, it may or may not fill up to the top, but we're showing it here, filled up all the way to the top. And then you will get infiltration into the soils. The water will go down as it infiltrates into the soils and gets filtered and mimics nature. And then you'll be back to normal conditions, which are most likely going to be dry most of the time. So those are kind of extreme conditions, but those are conditions that are experienced all the time in our dry creeks and a lot of our areas where stormwater naturally moves. So a good way to think about the types of plants that you would need to put in there is what is that water going to do on your site? And in a rain garden, in the bottom, that's going to be the place in the rain garden that is wet for the longest. It's going to be inundated for the longest, whatever that period of time is, and then it's also going to be dry. And then as you move up the slopes, you know, it's going to vary from dry to moist and periodically be inundated. And then at the top, it's just going to be your normal conditions, which are going to be usually dry, right? And so here's a very simple sample native plant palette. And very often it's the best approach is to go simple. So a lot of you are going to probably be familiar with these 4 species, but they're all really awesome. And really, if you were just looking at it, there's one species here that you could plant through the whole rain garden and it would still be awesome, and that's Texas frogfruit, because that is one plant that can take practically any condition you give to it. Really wet, really dry, any kind of soil type, full sun, full shade. It's almost indestructible. But the one thing I know that it does not do well with is deer. So deer will eat it. So if you have deer, that may be a problem. You might need to mix it with other things. But aside from that, it can go anywhere. And then we've got 3 others here I'm going to highlight: Lindheimer's Muley, Mealy Blue Sage, and a Mexican plum. And those could go either on the sides or the top. And so these are species that really have a wide range of site conditions that they can tolerate in nature. So Texas frogfruit, one of my absolute favorites. This one is one of those plants that does spread very quickly from itself. And if that's what you want, it's one of the best plants to do it, if not the best. And here you can see one patch in a rain garden. This is a commercial scale rain garden at one of our facilities. And you can see it's covered in flowers. And here I've got it growing in a pot. It does really well in a pot. A little more manageable in a pot too, if you don't want something kind of taking over a larger area. As I mentioned, it can take almost any site condition, full sun to full shade. It doesn't get very tall, maybe about 6 inches tall. And it blooms for an extended period of time from May to October. And one of the most amazing times to see this plant is in the summer when it is just deathly hot and you don't think anything could be outside in the heat, and you walk up to this rain garden and you look at this frog fruit and you see thousands and thousands of insects that are on it, that are getting nectar and pollen. And it's just amazing. It's a larval host for the Phaon crescent, common buckeye, and white peacock butterflies. And this one really has just blown me away with the amount of biodiversity that is able to use this plant. So here's just a sampling of 3 different yellow sulfur butterflies on the top and 5 different blue butterflies on the bottom, all different species here. I'm a novice butterfly person, so I wouldn't be able to tell you what they are without looking at notes, but they're all different. Here's even more, a variety of different skippers, butterflies, and moths. And the bees. So these are all, let's see, what is it, 12 different species of solitary bees and wasps. And because we're talking about bees, I'll mention the honeybee, European honeybee. There are hundreds of those also, but honeybees are really not very picky, and they are not a part of our local ecosystem, and they are a domesticated insect. And so those are not the bees that we're concerned about as far as our ecosystem health. We're concerned about the native solitary bees and other pollinators. As you can see here, there's a wide variety of them, and the fact that this plant continuously provides for this diversity, in addition to all of the honeybees that come to it, really is amazing. And then here's let's see, 10 different fly species. It's amazing. Once you start looking at these critters that are coming to your plants, you can really tell which plants are important to a lot of different species. So here we've got a hoverfly, beautiful hoverfly. Here's a really pretty green fly of some sort. Here's some bee mimicking flies that I see a lot. This one's super cute. We get a lot of these. Here's another bee mimicking fly. This one is a fly that mimics a Mexican honey wasp. It looks just like a Mexican honey wasp. And so again, it's really amazing once you start looking at these critters that come to these plants, and frog fruit is one of the best. And all of these photos that I just showed you from the frog fruit, almost all of them, maybe one of the butterflies that wasn't my photo, all have come from our rain garden there in downtown San Antonio. Okay, so the next species I wanted to highlight is Lindheimer's muley, probably also not a new one to many of you. It's one of our most beautiful ornamental native large grasses, and it looks great planted in rows. It's big enough that it actually can provide some screening, and it also looks really beautiful as a individual specimen in the landscape. This one is in my pocket prairie just from the other night, and I just love how the sun is coming through the beautiful seed heads there. And so because it's a grass, it's highly resistant to deer. They really don't. They tend to eat a lot of other stuff before they start eating many of the grasses. So that's one good thing for it. It will grow well in full sun to part shade. It will grow about 3 to 6 feet tall, and it can bloom from May through November. And mostly the wildlife uses for this are for shelter and cover and nesting material. It does provide some forage value, but mostly it's known for shelter and cover. And really, when we had the winter storm in February and we had snow everywhere, I was looking in my landscape trying to figure out where critters could find some sort of shelter and cover. And because I don't chop my muley down, like some people do, cut it down and remove all of that, it actually was one of the best places. I don't know if anything used it, but it was one of the best places that critters could have sought some cover in that snow event. It's got a beautiful blue-green color, evergreen, and the seed heads again are gorgeous. And what I have noticed in my own yard and at our facilities where we have this grass, you'll find that dragonflies will commonly be resting on these grasses. And then for a few nights here on the right, it's kind of hard to see because this is a photo from my phone, but as I was leaving, there are 5 queen butterflies on this Lindheimer's muley seed stalk here. They were roosting there at night because next to this in our rain garden, we had a patch of Greg's mistflower. So all these queens, if you know Greg's mistflower, they get attracted to it and they cover it. And so they would feed on the mistflower all day. And then for at least a few nights, they would roost up, they'd line up on these Lindheimer's muley stems. It was really cool. I wish I could have gotten a better photo of it. All right, the next plant I wanted to highlight is mealy blue sage. It's a salvia, and many of the salvias, if not most, are very highly resistant to deer. And this one will grow also in full sun to part shade. It gets to be about 2 to 3 feet tall, and it can bloom for an extended period, April through October. I think mine bloomed at least 3 times this year in my yard, and usually it's at least twice in a season. And they'll bloom and they'll go to seed, and then if conditions are right, they'll just bloom again. And mealy blue sage attracts a lot of butterflies, also seed-eating birds, hummingbirds for nectar, and it's been identified by the Xerces Society as having special value for native bees. Here's just a sampling of some of the butterflies. I have regularly seen monarchs using it, especially in our downtown location in the fall migration. A lot of times we have mealy blue sage paired with Greg's mistflower, and you'll have all those queen butterflies on the Greg's mistflower, and they'll chase the monarchs away. And so it's good to have other nectar sources for the monarchs around too. And mealy blue sage has been one of those that consistently I've seen monarchs using. And many other butterflies, as you can see here. These are 10 different species of skipper. Skippers seem to really like the mealy blue sage also. These are 8 different species of wasp. Actually, I think this one is a wasp, sorry. Solitary bees and bumblebees, and maybe 1 wasp. And then here we have the hummingbird. So the hummingbirds will tend to use red flowered plants more often if they're around in the landscape, but I do regularly see them come to the mealy blue sage. And then I definitely see the lesser goldfinch. Whenever the mealy blue sage starts setting seed, they'll come and they'll eat those buds and those developing seeds. And every time, I've seen them everywhere. And they're quick too. So if you're not paying attention, it's easy to miss them doing that. Okay, and so the last plant I wanted to highlight is Mexican plum. This is a tree that can grow up to 35 feet. Usually it's a little bit smaller, 16 to 18 feet maybe. Full sun to part shade. It usually grows on the edges of woods. And this is one of our first blooming plants in our area here. It can start blooming in February, February through April. And it attracts butterflies, fruit-eating birds, and then it also has been identified by the Xerces Society as having special value for native bees. It's a larval host for the eastern tiger swallowtail, as well as the Cecropia moth. And here's just a sampling of some of the critters. So we've got a question mark butterfly, a red admiral. Here we have a fly that looks a bee mimicking fly. Here's another fly. We've got a bee here. Monarchs this year, this spring, the timing was right. And I saw a lot of Mexican plums blooming in a downtown area, San Antonio. And the timing was right for the monarchs as they were coming through in the spring. So that's the first time I had really noticed that. And then here we have a beautiful warbler in the fall. So the Mexican plum does get it's not a real vibrant yellow or fall color, but it does get a yellow color that is attractive in the landscape in the fall, in addition to the really attractive fruits. And so our website is sariverauthority.org. We do have a lot of additional information that might be helpful for you in rain garden. We've got some videos and Q&A and some calculations if you want to try to target a certain amount of rainfall runoff in your rain garden. And then we also have a wide variety of other learning modules. We have a volunteer program if you're interested called the River Warriors. And if you sign up, you don't commit to anything. You will be given information when we have events, and sometimes it might be litter pickup. Other times it might be a planting event, or you just never know. There are a wide variety of opportunities for our volunteers. We've got an interesting new problem in downtown with the apple snails. So we've been training people on how to identify these giant apple snail clusters and help us try to manage those. So a lot of different opportunities with our volunteer program if you're interested. We've got lots of maps and data and lots of events, so please check it out. And I want to thank everybody again for listening and for having me here. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And are there any questions?
Lee, I have a question.
Lee, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Lee, I have a question. It's on the depth and the time of drainage for the depression of the rainwater garden. You said you want it to drain in 24 hours after the first drain. Is that just so the roots of the plants won't stay so wet, or is there another reason?
Well, you want it to drain within 24 hours, mostly because we don't want to start creating mosquito breeding habitat. These are not meant to be permanent water ponds. Those are totally separate systems, and you would want to, address mosquito breeding in those systems. These are really meant to mimic what are temporary wetland features in the landscape. These features do exist out there where they just temporarily hold the water in depressions. And you might even, it's kind of funny when people start looking at their landscape. A lot of times I've heard people say, oh, I don't have a wetland. I just have this little spot that collects water. Well, actually it could be a wetland. There are all kinds of wetlands, but it's intended to drain. And so the whole point of these rain gardens is that you're doing those three things. You're slowing down the water, you're letting it spread out in the landscape, and then you're letting it soak in to the soils and the plants, mimicking nature. And so 24 hours, there is a mosquito apparently that can complete its life cycle in 2 days. So definitely don't want the water standing in there for 48 hours. So we always just say, and it's just always been recommended, that you want to target 24 hours for it to drain. Now, things happen and you have back-to-back rain events. And so we had gosh, I don't even remember now. I'd have to add 1 or 2 years to whatever I think the timing is. But we had a bunch of big rain events all of a sudden here, not that long back, a 5-inch event and then a 3-inch event. And so our rain garden did have water the whole time because it just kept raining. And that's a whole different scenario. But when you're doing your infiltration test, you want to fill it up with water first so that it's completely wet. And then you really are able to tell by filling it up that it's going to drain, even if it's saturated. So that's the whole point of first getting it saturated and then filling it again, because your test hole is only a small part of where your garden's going to go. But that simple test, if you can dig, will tell you whether your soils are going to be supportive or not. And then you'll know whether to keep going, or you might have to think of a different approach. Mm-hmm. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? I wasn't able to monitor the chat, so I don't know if there's anything in chat.
No, we actually did not have any questions in the chat, I don't believe.
Are there any other questions about the plants or any of the other information, the viewers, or?
Are there any other plants you can think of off the top of your head that you would add to a rain garden?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So that's always the problem, is there's so many plants to choose from, and you just don't have a whole lot of time usually.
Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of really great ones. Snake herb is a really good one. That's a low growing ground cover. It gets purple flowers on it. It's also a larval host for the common buckeye and maybe another butterfly, but it is really hardy. And we have that in the bottom of one of our large rain gardens at one of our downtown facilities, and it has really done well. Let's see. We also use fall aster, Greg's mist flower. Those have been really great. Autumn sage, Turk's cap, Gulf muley. There's really a lot of species that you can use. I also like to use Weberville sedge. It's also called meadow sedge sometimes. Carex perdentata, and it's just a beautiful evergreen plant that can add some interest into the garden. So in my rain garden, I have a lot of heavy deer pressure, and the photo I showed you of mine is old. It's actually filled in quite a bit, but I've mostly got grasses because of the deer. So in my rain garden, and it's in part shade, which is another complicating factor. But in the middle, I have inland sea oats. So that's another really good ornamental grass that is used a lot. It's one that's not a clump former. It'll fill in and it'll spread pretty readily from seed, which is good, and if that's what you want. So I have that in the middle, and then I have a row of creek sedge on one side, and then I have a row of woolly stomodia on the other side. So I've learned that the deer don't eat woolly stomodia. It has a really nice silvery gray foliage, and it seems to do better in sun than in my conditions, and I don't give my stuff very much water at all, if any, only for establishment. So, but it's nice, it's a contrast, but I can't go in there with a lot of stuff I would like to because the deer would eat it all.
Okay. What about silver ponyfoot? Would that do well in a rain garden?
So that's a good one that we've used. We've used it at one of our facilities, and it did well along the top and the sides of the rain garden. It's real comparable to the woolly stomodia. They both have a similar color foliage, kind of a silvery gray foliage. The one thing I would say, though, it is nice. I prefer the woolly stomodia. The woolly stomodia gets flowers on it, and they're not real vibrant. You kind of have to look for them to know that they're there. They can vary from white to kind of a pinkish purple, but the pollinators find it. And I do find really interesting solitary bees that tend to use and flies that tend to use the woolly stomodia, whereas silver ponyfoot, you don't get any flowers with it. It's an attractive, very attractive plant, and I do use it in pots and hanging baskets. It's gorgeous. So it can work.
We have a question. Are there alternatives to rain gardens?
Well, yes. So if you're trying to address rainwater runoff, the alternatives might be a rain barrel, or a cistern type approach where you can capture that rainwater and slow it down, and slowly release it or reuse it. If there are also, ways to slow the water down in the landscape through maybe just an elongated and winding swale. Maybe you can't create a depression for whatever reason. Maybe it's because you can't dig, but you can direct the water through a vegetated shallow swale off, and by giving it a meandering path, you slow it down instead of sending it off quickly. So a lot of times what we see is when a gutter is oriented, it's put to send that water off quickly. So it's put on the driveway that leads down to the street and into maybe a storm drain, or maybe right into the ditch or the river. I don't know. Instead of sending it right onto the driveway, maybe you can just move that downspout over and let that water go over, even if it's just a turf grass area, redirect it into a vegetated area to where some of that water can be filtered by the plants. Again, even if it's turf grass, if it's moving through it, it's going to cause some settling out of particles, things like that. But definitely, if you can get that water into the soils, then you can do a lot of filtering and cleaning that way. So that's another approach, is if you have a gutter system but you can't do a rain garden, maybe thinking about where you're sending that water. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Even in like I said, a shallow little swale, if you have little terraces or little check dams, in it to create little depressions. Instead of one big rain garden, maybe you just have a little step pool system that sends it off, and any little bit can help, really. And if you're planting it with the native plants, then you're creating this natural system that can benefit wildlife. And a lot of times, if it's temporarily holding the water, you might see wildlife come down there, birds and whatnot come down and use that water like they would in a natural system.
Thank you. That was a good question, Veronica.
And just, of course, native landscape gardening in and of itself, you know, the structure of your plants can help to intercept rainwater and help slow it down just by being present, you know, not being a mowed turf grass.
We have another question. Do you have a list on your website of the native plants that are good for rain gardens?
We do. Let's see, we do. I don't know how to direct you to the right page. So we do have a search box on our website, and if you entered rain garden in there, it should take you there. We have a section for sustainability, and it's within that section on our website. And we have a list for Bexar County. It's a small list. Probably has all the 4 species already highlighted and maybe a few more.
Okay.
But we also have more detailed lists, not specific to rain gardens, but we have a low impact development technical design guidance manual. It's a mouthful, but it has an appendix of mostly native species with all their characteristics. And actually, there's another really useful guide. Let's see if I have it here in I do. This one, that maybe you've seen this one before. This is the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. You can get this online too. This has a good plant appendix. It's the Watershed Stewardship for the Edwards Aquifer Region, a low impact development manual. And you can get this online at the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance website. That one has a great list. Of course, the Native Plant Society state website has a number of different native plant lists too. And I'm happy, feel free to contact me if you have questions, specific questions, because there are so many plants. One of the biggest problems with plants is availability. So maybe the species is just not a species that's currently available readily, or maybe a lot of times it's just the timing. And so a lot of times when you go to try to get a native plant you want, you might have to substitute with something else just because it's not available when you want it, if you can't wait for it.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, Lee, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your experience with us. Gave us a lot of really useful information.